I want you to try and imagine something for a second. Picture yourself standing on the bridge of a vessel that is roughly the size of the Empire State Building.
Laid on its side, yeah.
Right on its side, exactly. And you are carrying millions of barrels of highly flammable crude oil.
Right.
You're navigating through this incredibly narrow, highly militarized geographical choke point in the dead of night.
It's a terrifying scenario to even visualize, honestly.
Yeah, it really is. And to protect yourself from getting hit by an anti-ship missile, you've made this massive, potentially catastrophic decision. You've reached over and flipped the switch to turn off your tracking systems.
You're attempting to go completely invisible.
Right. Or at least you think you are.
Yeah, and what makes it so unsettling is that this isn't, some hypothetical thought experiment for a military college.
No, not at all.
It is a very real, very high-stakes gamble that is currently being debated in boardrooms and on the bridges of massive commercial vessels right now.
Which brings us to today. Welcome to today's deep dive. We are unpacking this really urgent, fascinating article from the DeepDraft. It's written by Captain Raghu Sharma, dated March 9th, 2026.
Titled, Lessons from the Tanker War of 1980s, Why Dark Transits Risk Modern Ship Owners.
That's the one. And alongside this article, we've got a stack of incredibly revealing maritime images that really, they just bring the sheer scale of this reality to life.
They absolutely do.
So our mission today is to look at the current escalating crisis in the Strait of Hormuz. We're going to examine this really dangerous temptation for modern ship owners to perform what they call dark transits.
Right, turning off the transponders.
Exactly. And figure out why trying to hide in the modern information age might actually be the most dangerous tactical error a captain can make.
Yeah.
So, okay, let's unpack this. Set the operational scene for us.
Sure. So to understand the gravity of this dynamic, we have to look at the acute crisis unfolding on the water as we speak. Around February 28, 2026, we saw a severe military escalation in the Gulf.
And since then, up to 8 commercial vessels have been struck.
8. Yeah. This isn't just geopolitical posturing or warning shots. It is a live fire environment. And as a direct result of that kinetic threat, transit volumes to the Strait of Hormuz have collapsed by over 90%.
90%. We are essentially looking at a complete logistical paralysis.
Cool.
And the visual evidence of this in our sources is just chilling. There's a photograph of a tanker called the Skylight. It's one of the vessels that took a direct hit.
That image is striking.
It's unbelievable. You see this massive blue and red hull, and right in the middle, these intense, violent orange flames are just pouring out of the side of the steel.
Yeah.
And above it, there is this colossal pillar of thick, black, oily smoke billowing up into the sky. The smoke completely dwarfs the superstructure of the ship itself.
It completely removes any abstraction from the situation.
When you see the sheer thermal mass of an oil fire on the water, the reality of the phrase commercial vessel struck hits you right in the chest.
It really does. And because of this immediate visible danger, the geography of the region becomes a massive operational bottleneck. We have a map here of the Strait of Hormuz, and it illustrates the geographic trap perfectly.
Squeezed right in there.
Exactly. You have these very narrow, clearly defined shipping lanes squeezing between Iran to the north and the Musandam Peninsula of Oman to the south, with the UAE situated right there as well.
There is very little room to maneuver.
Barely any.
The shipping lanes look like tiny threads trying to thread a very tight, very heavily armed needle.
And because of the strikes, no one wants to be the first to thread that needle. We currently have over 150 tankers just anchored outside this choke point.
Just sitting there.
Sitting idle in the Gulf of Oman, waiting for some kind of clarity or de-escalation. And to put the scale of that backlog in perspective, approximately 9% of the global mainstream VLCC fleet.
Those are the very large crude carriers.
Right. 9% of that entire global fleet is currently trapped north of the strait.
Wow. Having 9% of the global fleet suddenly trapped in one geographical pocket sends the economics into absolute overdrive.
Oh, absolutely.
The article notes that freight rates for these VLCCs have skyrocketed past $420,000 per day.
Which is astronomical.
At the very same time, major war risk underwriters, like the Scull Club, are issuing cancellation notices for their coverage in that specific zone.
Yeah, they're pulling out.
So you have these massive generational financial rewards dangling in front of these companies, but the safety net of maritime insurance is being aggressively yanked away.
And that extreme financial friction brings us to the core temptation Captain Sharma writes about. the dark transit.
Right.
Because there is no officially declared blockade sealing the corridor. It remains this environment of militarized uncertainty. Some ship owners are considering running the strait at night.
And intentionally disabling their AIS transponders to try and slip through unnoticed.
Right.
Now, to play devil's advocate for a second, if you are a captain responsible for a vessel and a crew in a live fire zone, turning off your beacon seems like a logical self-preservation instinct.
It feels intuitive.
Yeah. And legally, they actually have an avenue for this, right? The outline notes that disabling AIS is permitted temporarily under SOLAS Regulation V19 for acute threats.
Yes.
So they aren't necessarily going rogue, they are utilizing a safety loophole.
You hit on something crucial there. SOLAS Regulation V19 does allow a master to switch off the AIS if they believe continuing to broadcast it would compromise the safety or security of the ship.
Okay, so it's legal.
It is. But the issue isn't whether they have the regulatory permission to do it. The issue is whether it actually works in a modern combat environment.
Right.
Captain Sharma argues brilliantly that this choice carries consequences that go far beyond basic bridge navigation. To understand why relying on that SOLAS loophole is a massive gamble today, we really have to connect the dots between the 1980s tanker war and the reality of modern digital navigation.
Let's do that, because the contrast in how these massive machines are piloted is incredible. Back in the 1980s tanker war, the physical threat profile was actually pretty similar.
You had anti-ship missiles,
Yeah.
fast attack craft, mines.
Exactly. But the actual mechanics of navigating the ship were completely different. Back then, manual navigation was the standard. You were using paper charts, parallel rulers, dividers, taking visual bearings off coastlines.
It was a deeply procedural, human-driven process.
Right.
In the 1980s, manual navigation was the normal operating condition. It wasn't a backup plan you had to suddenly dust off. It was simply how you sailed a vessel of that size.
You just did the math yourself.
Yeah. Traffic was managed without the intense, continuous integration of GNSS positional data and without the automated collision prediction systems we rely on today.
Compare that to the photograph in our sources of a modern ship's bridge.
Yeah.
It genuinely looks like the flight deck of a spaceship.
It really does.
You're looking out over the ocean through the glass, but the entire console in front of you is dominated by these large, glowing digital screens.
Huge displays.
You've got intense digital radar mapping, electronic chart displays or ECDIS joysticks, rows of illuminated status buttons. It is a fully integrated, continuously updating electronic environment.
And what's fascinating here is what Captain Sharma calls the technological flip. Today, those glowing screens and continuous digital inputs are the primary mode of operating the vessel.
Okay.
Manual navigation, pulling out the paper charts and the dividers, is now just the fallback. It's the contingency plan for when things go wrong.
That makes sense.
Modern systems undeniably enhance safety and efficiency when conditions are stable, but they create a deep underlying interdependence. All of those screens rely on external data streams.
So it's essentially a digital house of cards. If one sensor feed degrades, the whole operational picture warps.
That's the core of it.
Yeah.
When a system like GNSS degrades, whether through intentional military jamming or GPS spoofing in a conflict zone, that failure cascades across the bridge.
Because everything is connected.
Exactly. Your electronic charts become suspect, your automated collision avoidance predictions lose reliability, and your AIS identity data gets compromised.
So a skeptical ship owner might look at that and argue, well, if the GPS is getting spoofed by military actors and my digital data is unreliable anyway, why not just utilize that SOLAS loophole, turn off the AIS, and go dark? The system is broken anyway.
Well, Captain Sharma points out that this fundamentally misunderstands the mechanics of crisis bridge management. If we connect this to the bigger picture of navigating a contested waterway, spoofing degrades the where, your positional accuracy. But your AIS provides the who, your verified identity, to everyone else in the area.
The where versus the who, that is a vital distinction.
It is. Maintaining that AIS broadcast gives the other commercial ships and the military vessels around you a verified identity. They can hail you on the VHF radio by name.
Right?
And they can correlate your specific vessel with the anonymous blips on their radar. If you deliberately go dark, you remove that entire cooperative layer.
You just become an unknown blip.
You are actively complicating traffic awareness in an environment that is already severely degraded by the conflict. Furthermore, going dark completely hamstrings the naval coalitions that are trying to provide regional overwatch.
Because they don't know who you are either.
Exactly. They rely on that cooperative tracking to differentiate a merchant vessel from a threat. A dark vessel effectively delays its own rescue because the naval forces have to spend precious time verifying who you are.
But wait, if these captains and ship owners are operating billion-dollar companies, surely they know that turning off a transponder doesn't actually make them invisible.
You would think so.
I mean, look at the aerial photographs we have of these VLCCs. We've got top-down shots of these huge tankers sitting in the water. They look like floating islands of steel with massive, complex networks of pipes across the deck.
They're colossal.
There's a tiny little pilot boat next to one of them in the photo, and the scale is just absurd. You cannot hide something the size of a skyscraper simply by turning off a radio beacon. Why are they still tempted to try it?
The temptation comes from a lingering, outdated mindset. There is a psychological comfort in feeling like you've taken action to hide.
Like covering your eyes.
Kind of, yeah. But hostile actors in 2026 aren't just sitting in a command center looking at an open-source AIS website. They rely on multiple, overlapping, highly sophisticated detection systems.
Right.
They have surface search radar, they have infrared sensors that pick up the massive heat signature of a ship's engines, they have electronic intelligence gathering that picks up your internal comms, and perhaps most importantly, they have satellite surveillance, specifically synthetic aperture radar, or SAR.
We should clarify what SAR actually does, because it renders the whole concept of hiding at night completely obsolete.
It really does.
Synthetic aperture radar essentially bounces microwave signals off the surface of the Earth. It doesn't care if it's midnight. It doesn't care if there's a heavy thunderstorm or dense cloud cover.
It will bounce right off that massive steel hull and paint a perfectly clear picture of your vessel in a command center hundreds of miles away.
So much for going invisible.
AIS silence does not create invisibility. All it does is remove your cooperative transparency from the people who might actually want to help you. You are still completely detectable to anyone with military-grade or even commercial-grade sensing systems who might want to target you.
So if you're not actually invisible to the people firing the missiles, what does going dark actually achieve in the real world?
According to the article, AIS silence in today's environment only produces intense scrutiny. We are living in a fundamentally different information era than the captains of the 1980s tanker war.
That brings us to the entire global ecosystem of observation. We have an image in our sources of an AIS tracking map covering the Strait of Hormuz and the UAE coastline.
It's dense.
It is completely covered in these dense, overlapping swarms of red and green arrows, thousands of them representing individual ships. It represents near real-time visibility. It shows exactly what the global tracking network looks like to anyone with an internet connection.
And that real-time visibility creates an immense amount of operational pressure that simply didn't exist 40 years ago. In the 1980s, the conflict unfolded with a much slower information cycle.
News took days to filter back.
Right, decision windows were longer. Today, a strike on a vessel, a spoofed position, or a sudden unexplained gap in an AI's broadcast circulates the globe in a matter of minutes.
So when you utilize that soulless loophole and turn off your AIs, you aren't slipping away quietly. You are basically raising a giant flashing red flag to global algorithms.
Charterers, insurers, compliance desks, maritime intelligence firms, they are all monitoring these data streams algorithmically. When a massive tanker suddenly vanishes from the cooperative tracking grid in a known conflict zone, the absence of data becomes a massive signal in itself.
It tells them something is wrong.
It allows underwriters to reassess their exposure in real time. The modern captain isn't just sailing through physical water. They are navigating through a dense, unforgiving ecosystem of digital observation.
And people are clearly getting desperate to navigate that ecosystem safely. There is a detail in Captain Sharma's article that really underscores the sheer desperation on the water right now.
The destination fields.
Yes. Because the crews feel so exposed and vulnerable, some vessels are actually going into their AI systems and altering their static destination fields, the part of the broadcast that usually says Rotterdam or Singapore.
And they are changing it.
They're changing it to broadcast phrases like Muslims on board.
It's a stark human example of how acute the pressure is on these crews. They are attempting to use the destination data field as a makeshift psychological shield, trying to signal non-hostility to whoever might be watching the data stream and picking targets.
But the article makes it brutally clear that this offers no true kinetic protection. A missile doesn't read a destination field.
No, it doesn't.
It just highlights the complete erosion of data integrity in a crisis. You have a system that was specifically designed for cooperative transparency and navigational safety, and it's being contorted into this unreliable, desperate signaling tool.
This also highlights the human dimension of the information age. Real-time visibility changes the psychological reality for the crew on board. In the 80s, communication latency provided a sort of mental buffer. You focused on the ship.
Right.
Today, crews are getting real-time updates about strikes on vessels just a few miles away on their personal smartphones, often before the shipping company's security desk even issues a formal advisory.
That's intense.
Their families are tracking their ship's anomalies online from their living rooms. The conflict exists in the digital data stream just as much as it exists on the physical water.
Let's pivot to the financial mechanics of this, because the money is what is driving this entire dangerous dynamic. We talked about freight rates hitting $420,000 a day for a VLCC.
Yes.
To an outside observer, that sounds like an unbelievable windfall. If I'm a ship owner sitting in an office in London or Athens, I'm looking at that daily rate and thinking the dark transit might actually be worth the risk.
It is a staggering number, and it purely signals extreme scarcity in the market. But Captain Sharma unpacks this to reveal what he calls a dangerous financial illusion. The math behind that $420,000 a day is incredibly sobering when you look at the downside.
Break down the actuarial math for us.
You have to separate your expected actuarial risk from your potential catastrophic loss. If an actuary determines there is a 2% probability of strike during your transit through the strait, that percentage yields an expected capital exposure of roughly $3 million.
So that $3 million statistical risk effectively wipes out the so-called bonus you'd earn from a week or two of this massively elevated freight rate.
It erodes the margin immediately. But that $3 million is just the statistical expectation. The actual value at risk if a strike physically happens to your vessel is astronomical.
Because we aren't just talking about losing the freight revenue for that specific voyage. We're talking about the physical asset itself.
A modern VLCC represents roughly $150 million in capital asset value for the steel hull alone. Adds to that the receipt value of the cargo, millions of barrels of crude oil. Then you have to add the massive, nearly unquantifiable liabilities for environmental pollution, the nightmare of wreck removal in a contested waterway, and, most tragically, the potential for crew fatalities.
Freight is incremental revenue. Capital exposure is absolute. That line from the article distills the entire boardroom dilemma.
A rate of $420,000 a day is just a market mechanism responding to the constrained supply of available ships. It does absolutely nothing to neutralize the reality of a catastrophic multi-hundred-million-dollar loss.
And the insurance is gone.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Major P&I clubs, the maritime insurers, are canceling war risk cover for this specific zone. So that immense capital exposure isn't being distributed across an insurance pool anymore. It is migrated entirely and directly onto the shipowner's own corporate balance sheet.
And that massive void in insurance coverage brings a very specific political element into the equation. Because the private market is pulling out, we have a major political data point to look at. The sources note that U.S. President Donald Trump issued a statement on social media declaring that the U.S. will provide financial guarantees and potential Navy escorts for maritime trade in the region.
Right.
And we should state clearly that we are analyzing this strictly through an operational lens as a market data point, completely impartially, ignoring the politics entirely. How does a statement like that change the math for a ship owner?
Operationally, it is an attempt to inject confidence back into a paralyzed market. To illustrate what that backing looks like physically, we have two striking images of the naval presence in our sources.
I'm looking at them now.
One is a photograph of a warship launching a Tomahawk missile during Operation Epic Fury. There's a huge burst of fire and smoke is billowing out over the ocean. It's a display of raw kinetic power.
It's intense.
The other is this beautiful yet deeply intimidating silhouette of a Type 45 destroyer cutting through the water against a vibrant sunset. The firepower to protect these lanes certainly exists.
The firepower is there, but Captain Shauna's analysis points out a critical operational limitation. A political directive on a social media platform does not instantly materialize as a tactical shield on the water.
Generating that tactical shield takes immense coordination. More importantly, state funds and sovereign financial guarantees cannot prevent a kinetic strike from physically impacting the hull of a ship.
It just pays for it afterward.
Exactly. Insurance, whether private or state-backed, pays out after the disaster has occurred. It doesn't stop the missile from flying. And while Navy escorts are a formidable deterrent, setting up the framework for organized escorts requires time. Until those gray hulls are physically present, steaming alongside your commercial vessel, the risk to your crew and your asset remains absolute.
So what does this actually mean for the ship owners sitting in their office right now? They are looking at the $420,000 day rate, they have a canceled insurance policy, and they have a promise of future state protection. How do they make the call?
Transit decisions sit at the intersection of operational judgment, the insurance conditions, and the charter party.
The charter party being the contract.
Yes, the actual binding contractual agreement between the ship owner and the entity hiring the vessel, the cargo owner, which dictates the specific terms, routes, and liabilities of the voyage. If you, as the ship owner, elect to proceed into the strait without explicit insurance endorsement, you are transferring all of that exposure asymmetrically to yourself.
And likely violating the terms of your charter party in the process.
Most likely, yes.
The article says a miscalculation here doesn't just damage a single vessel, it creates a blast radius of liability that attaches to the entire enterprise. You could literally bankrupt a legacy shipping company with one failed dark transit.
This brings us to the true, enduring lesson of the 1980s tanker war. If we connect this historical comparison to the bigger picture, the turning point in the 80s wasn't that ship captains suddenly developed brilliant new tactical maneuvers to sneak through the dark.
It wasn't a Hollywood movie where a hotshot captain outsmarted the radar and saved the day.
Far from it. The actual turning point that stabilized the region was the implementation of organized naval convoys. It was a highly structured, state-backed framework that stepped in to absorb and redistribute the massive physical and financial risks that the private insurance market simply could not handle anymore.
So it required a collective effort.
Sustained commercial operations in a hostile maritime corridor require structured sovereign protection.
Which means the current ambiguity is essentially a trap. The high freight rates signal a massive opportunity, but the sudden withdrawal of insurance signals a catastrophic concentration of risk, and those two signals are not equal.
They are entirely disproportionate. The maritime industry is currently waiting for structure. President Trump's declarations attempt to signal a move back toward that historical model of collective security.
Right.
But until that collective shield is a physical, organized reality on the water, choosing to utilize a SOLAS loophole to run a dark transit is not a display of tactical brilliance. It is ultimately an unmanaged enterprise gamble.
An unbelievable gamble.
Without that structural protection, you aren't just risking a single voyage's revenue, you are risking the very foundations of your shipping enterprise and the lives of your crew.
So why does all of this incredibly niche maritime strategy matter to you, listening right now? You probably don't own a $150 million crude oil tanker. But this entire scenario perfectly illustrates just how fragile our global supply chains really are.
They're incredibly delicate.
The raw energy that powers your local economy, your commute, and your life move through these intense, heavily militarized choke points. More importantly, it reveals a profound truth about our hyper-connected digital world. When you try to unplug from the system to avoid a perceived danger like a captain turning off an AIS transponder, you often end up creating infinitely more risk for yourself by becoming an unverified anomaly in a sea of data.
It is the ultimate paradox of the modern information age. Transparency can certainly feel like a vulnerability when you are under threat, but intentional obscurity in a highly monitored algorithmic environment is an even bigger red flag.
That leaves us with a final, provocative thought for you to ponder long after this deep dive ends. We have seen how digital transparency and cooperative tracking systems can suddenly transform into a massive operational liability during a geopolitical crisis at sea. So, how might other heavily tracked civilian industries think about commercial aviation or the global trucking and logistics networks? How might they have to radically adapt their technologies and their operational mindsets if, suddenly, their own everyday tracking data was weaponized against them?
It raises a profound question about the inherent resilience or the fragility of every digital tracking system our modern economy relies on.
It really does. Something to mull over the next time you track a flight or a package online. Thanks for joining us for this deep dive into the Strait of Hormuz. We'll catch you on the next one.